Perfect. So, hi everyone. Today we have the pleasure of listening to Rutger Claassen discussing social ownership democracy. Rutger, for many of us, needs no presentation. Still, I'm going to say some words because maybe there's the off chance that some of you don't know him. So, Rutger Claassen is professor of political philosophy and economics ethics at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies here at Utrecht. At the intersection of politics, economics, and ethics, focusing on theoretical and normative questions about democracy, freedom, markets, and justice. We are very happy to have you, Rutger. You have 40 to 45 minutes for your presentation, and then we will have the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see the
Yes,
presentation?
we can.
Okay, good. Great. Thanks for inviting me. It's a wonderful opportunity to see so many of you, even though I'm currently abroad from Utrecht, visiting Florence at the EUI. It's fantastic, to be able to present some of my research. And what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes, hopefully, I'll try to stick to time, is to present a paper that has become important to me as part of the ERC-sponsored project that I've done over the last couple of years about business corporations as political actors. It's still under review in a revised version, so I'm still looking forward to comments, also because I hope to include it in a book on corporations that I hope to make in the coming year. So social ownership democracy is the title. And by way of introduction, I'm going to move to the next slide. Does that work? The movement of the slides? Yes, I can see no one now. So I'm just looking at my slides and there are no heads. So I'm talking into a void. So what I start with is the debate in political philosophy about politico-economic regimes. And this is very much in line, I think, with your visions of the future project, the idea that there are various political economic regimes that we see as alternatives in political philosophy, but more broadly speaking, I think in political economic discussions. And to start with, I want to give you sort of a very rough overview of the landscape and then position the alternative, which I want to defend in this paper, social ownership democracy. So this is probably a very, very basic dichotomy between left-wing and right-wing political economic systems that you're all familiar with from 20th century debates between, on the one hand, state planning forms of socialism, and on the other hand, pure or laissez-faire forms of capitalism. Where the debate really has become interesting in political philosophy is with John Rawls's intervention, who argued that these two alternatives are not the most probable ones, but that we need to look into various intermediate alternatives. And he discussed, on one hand, welfare state capitalism as such an intermediate political economic regime. On the other hand, liberal or market socialism, I will use these terms as synonyms, and property owning democracy. Welfare state capitalism to Rawls was, although it represents the post-Second World War consensus, not the best way of conceiving of an alternative for state socialism and pure capitalism, but he favored looking more closely into liberal or market socialism and property owning democracy. Now, my lens today will be on ownership. And what is striking here, and this is also why I position these alternatives the way I've done on the slide, including the color settings, is that liberal socialism shares an important element with state socialism, namely the fact that corporations are owned by the state. I will say more about that as we go along. While on the other hand, property owning democracy shares an important element with pure capitalism, namely that corporations are owned by individual citizens. I will talk in a moment about this term open corporation that you see there. So what I want to do is to today defend that there is an alternative to both market socialism or liberal socialism and property owning democracy. These two alternatives have really dominated debate in political philosophy over the last, let's say, 2-3 decades. And then defend this alternative, which I call social ownership democracy. There are two main forms, member-owned and corporations and foundation-owned corporations. For these forms, I would argue corporations are neither owned by the state nor by individual citizens. We'll get to this as we go along. So how will I proceed? I will first say something about one particular theory that was developed in the 1990s by Scott Arnold, borrow some elements from it, then criticize it, also criticize work by Alan Thomas. We'll get to that, which bases itself on Arnold's theory. And then I move on to the constructive program, the 3 principles of social ownership. And then I look at different forms, how to do this in practice. And I'll discuss one important objection in the final section under the heading, the return of the investor. So the first half of the paper sort of sets up the case and criticizes existing theories, and thereby looks into this debate between market socialism and property-owning democracy. And then the second half of the paper builds the case for the alternative to both property-owning democracy and market socialism. So here we go. Scott Arnold wrote this book, The Philosophy and Economics of Market Socialism, in 1994, if I remember well. And then Alan Thomas, about a decade ago now, wrote Republic of Equals. These books are important for what I'm going to tell today. Alan Thomas builds on Arnold, as I mentioned, but also twists his theory in a very important way. And this will be a foundation for what I then do in positioning my own alternative. Arnold's theory exists roughly of 2 elements, and to one of these I'm very critical. The other one is really what I want to take over, and this is the reason that I build on Arnold partially. So the first part of his theory is normative theory. He proposes a normative theory of exploitation, and this is the part I'm going to be critical about later, but for the moment I want you, for the sake of argument, to accept it as I present it. Arnold says that in a market economy, one party is exploited by another party if that party gets less than they would get in a fair exchange. So the benchmark, normatively speaking, for determining when one party is exploited by another one is the perfect market. This is the so-called failure of reciprocity condition that he proposes. Then he combines that with a so-called no real alternatives condition. He said it has to be true, in addition, that the exploited party had no significantly better alternative, right? Otherwise, that party would not be condemned to do business, even if there's no real reciprocity in the exchange between both parties. So this is sort of exploitation, which he takes as his ground norm, and I will follow him in doing that, but I will give a different theory of exploitation later on. He then asks the question, okay, so where and when do we find exploitation in the economy? And that will then lead to sort of conclusions about which economic alternatives are good and which ones are bad, according to his view. To sort of make this step towards real economic forms, he applies his normative theory of exploitation, or he combines it with transaction cost economics. And he says, in the economy, long-term relationships between different parties are crucial. So think of a firm and its suppliers, a firm and its workers. And in these long-term relationships, one party can exploit the other by exploiting information asymmetries. So one party has a better knowledge of particular elements of the relation, for example, in moral hazard situations or adverse selection cases. And that leads to exploitation of one party by the others. Now, in a free market, Arnold thinks institutions will arise that minimize the risks of such exploitation. So he thinks in terms of a market economy as a quasi-evolutionary process in which institutions are created to minimize the risks of exploitation, but nonetheless, exploitation can never be fully prevented, because in any long-term relationship, there is a threat that one party will exploit the others. This is the basis, and then he's going to a sequence of applications of these foundational thoughts. First of all, with respect to the classical firm. So the classical firm in this literature is a sort of term of art to refer to a firm that is not incorporated, in which a variety of roles is in one hand. And the basis for this way of thinking about the classical firm comes from economists in the early 1970s, Elkin and Damzats, who've produced a theory in which they distinguish a manager who needs to monitor workers that would otherwise be inclined to shirk. This is a sort of application of this idea of exploitation between two parties because of an information asymmetry. A residual claimant, a capital provider, and an ultimate decision maker. All of these roles in a simple classical firm are in one hand, and you see this in the illustration on the right-hand side of the slide. So there's an entrepreneur who is both managing the workers, who gets the profits, who's the residual claimant, who provides the capital as an input, and who makes ultimate decisions. So the only party that is to be distinguished from this is then workers, because they are managed and paid by this classical firm. I call this in the paper this sort of idea that this classical firm, this setup is not exploitative. So this is Arnold's judgment. I call this an application of the role bundling principle. So that's my term. The principle is that other things being equal, if you put a number of roles in the same hand, then that will lead to a situation that is minimizing exploitation, because you cannot exploit yourself, right? So that's the idea Arnold has. So it doesn't really make sense for the manager to exploit the residual claimant or the ultimate decision maker to exploit the capital provider, because all of these functions that you need in a firm are simply in the hand of an entrepreneur who operates solo and who hires a set of workers. I'll say more about the worker relation to the firm in a moment, because you might have a question there, which I will anticipate later. So the classical firm is a very small firm in which all of these roles are in one hand, but very often things become more complicated, production scales up, and some roles get sort of disentangled or unbundled. In particular, we move to the open corporation, which is Arnold's term for what we most often refer to as the business corporation. This second application of his transaction cost theory generates the same verdict as his application to the classical firm. Namely, the open corporation is in general not exploitative, according to Arnold. You see that the roles of manager and the other three roles, residual claimant, capital provider, and ultimate decision maker, are now unbundled. And that generates the familiar problem of what that is known as the principal agent problem, that the principal, the investor, will be exploited by the manager, who has superior knowledge of what goes on in the firm, because the manager is the person who leads the firm on a day-to-day basis. You see the other stakeholder groups surrounding the corporation, but the focus is really on how the unbundling of the four roles that I've just mentioned between managers on one hand and the other three roles on the other hand leads to exploitation between them. And Arnold endorses the familiar precepts that we know from agency theory that was created in the 1980s to make sure or to minimize the occurrence of exploitation between them. So managers need to be incentivized and disciplined by investors through familiar means such as executive compensation that is aligned with the investors' interests, namely by giving them stock options, disciplining them through the share market, the market for corporate control, that is by having an effective threat that the firm would be taken over by other investors, etc., etc. Other parties, workers, consumers, suppliers, are still not exploited in Arnold's view. I say a bit more about this later. Finally, and this is why Arnold wrote his book, he applies the theory to market socialism, a form of socialism that became very popular in the 1990s after the demise of the Soviet Union, when many socialists moved from central planning forms of socialism to market-based forms of socialism. There was a renewed interest in the system in which this was most often, in which this was best realized, namely the Yugoslav system in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And many intellectuals began talking about market socialism in the 1990s. Now, Arnold is critical of this and says that this is a form in which there is exploitation. So what he wants to do is to condemn the market socialism, while on the other hand saying classical firms and open corporations are non-exploitative. So market socialism is exploitative, Arnold says. Why? For two different reasons. One I will leave out of consideration here, which has to do with workers exploiting other workers. My main focus here will be on the relation between workers on the other hand and the state, the investors, namely the state on the other hand. What is market socialism? Market socialism is the political economic regime in which workers are residual claimants, so they receive the profits from the firm. They're also the ultimate decision makers, the controllers of the firm. This means they control the managers. These two roles are in the hands of the workers. The managers are separate. They're elected by the workers. And then capital providers are also separate. The state owns capital and invests this in worker-managed firms. That's the setup. Now, Arnold says in such a setup, workers will collectively exploit the investing state. They have an incentive with the capital that they get from the state through public banks. They have an incentive to take the gains from that arrangement, so to go for short-term gains because they have the claim on the profits, while not taking care of the capital stock, which depreciates the capital stock that they have received from public banks. And investors cannot control this process since there are information asymmetries, so they cannot really judge how much depreciation of the capital stock is going on. So they are in a vulnerable position with respect to workers. And at the end, therefore, they will fail to invest because they see that the risk is too large and the system collapses. So Arnold's theory then leads to the conclusion that liberal socialism is exploitative, but that pure capitalism is really the best, least exploitative option which we should go for, right? So Arnold is a defender of pure capitalism. Now, Alan Thomas, in his theory of property-owning democracy, has gone back to Arnold's theory, and this is also what sparked my interest in looking into Arnold's theory, but not to defend pure capitalism, but to defend property-owning democracy, right? So the intermediate option, if you want, between market socialism and pure capitalism. Alan Thomas accepts that the open corporation is the best sort of institutional form to have economic activity. So he argues with Arnold against the liberal socialists, and he uses Arnold's arguments for this. But then, on the other hand, he also criticizes the open corporation for its exploitative potential under current conditions of wealth inequality. And this is where things get really interesting, in my view. So Thomas says, if there is a situation in which the shares in an open corporation are owned by a class of very wealthy people, then they will be inclined to, and I quote here from Thomas's work, to use their political power to create a political environment where more negative externalities are tolerated, profit is privatized, and social costs are outsourced. So there is a problem with the open corporation in Thomas's view. There's also a problem with market socialism, but there's also a problem with the open corporation in terms of the vulnerability of the system to exploitation. However, Thomas says this is a contingent problem. So we can solve this problem because the problem arises because of this concentration of wealth, of the shares of these corporations in the hands of a wealthy class. What we need to do for that is to disperse these shares. So he says, under a wide dispersal of shares, the wealthy have less to gain from profit and as much to lose as everyone else from negative externalities. So an institutional reform changes their collective behavior. End of quote. And this is something that I want to dispute. One more thing about Alan Thomas. He says we can actually build such a system in which the shares are widely dispersed through John Roemer's coupon socialism. I won't talk about this here for the sake of this presentation, but the general idea is that in Roemer's scheme, all shares are dispersed amongst all citizens in a specific country. For Thomas, this counts as a form of property owning democracy. We can debate that if you want in the Q&A. Against Thomas, I want to argue that there is a problem with property owning democracy, and that therefore both market socialism and property owning democracy are not sufficient to save us from widespread exploitation in the economic system. I'm going to accept what they both accept, namely transaction cost economics. So this analysis where you say, we look at different parties. You've seen my illustrations on the slide so far, and these parties, one can exploit the others in the long-term relationships that they have in and around the corporation. I'm also going to accept this idea of role bundling, that if various roles are in one hand, then these different roles cannot exploit each other. But I want to argue that the open corporation structure does create incentives for investors to exploit other parties. So the setup of the open corporation that you see here on the slide does give incentives to exploit. Control rights, so the ultimate decision-making rights, give investors power to make exploitative decisions. The profit rights, which they have as residual claimants, give them the incentives to do so. And something curiously downplayed or minimized, I think, in both Arnold's and Thomas's books, limited liability limits the downside risk of doing so. So investors through the corporate structure have limited or no risk to the downside of their investments. And this is an important incentive for them to risk more than one would if one would have to bear the liability. This is not something I've invented. There's a almost 2 centuries old criticism now of these features of the open corporation. Why does Arnold miss this? And here I come to a point that you might have wondered about earlier in the presentation. Well, because he has a very particular normative theory of exploitation that, as you've seen, is tied to the idea of a perfect market. Right, so there's no exploitation in a perfect competition. Why are workers in particular not exploited according to Arnold? Well, because the labor market is functioning, in his view, sufficiently well so as not to call it what he calls stagnant. There's no employer's cartel that is imposing prices on workers. Workers and employers can freely bargain between themselves. And if workers don't like the bargain, then they go elsewhere. Hence, there's no structural exploitation in the labor market. And sort of workers are the most important group of others. You see my slide with suppliers, consumers. You can imagine other stakeholders of the corporation. He doesn't talk about them. He only talks about workers, and he argues they are not structurally exploited. If we think otherwise, he says, then you would have to show that there is a structural divergence from perfect competition. Now, this way of thinking about exploitation, I think, is problematic. We need to reject Arnold's market-based normative theory of exploitation. Instead, we should move to a non-market theory of exploitation, and say that one party is exploited if it has to accept an offer because of the background conditions being unjust. Now, would this other party have lived in a fully just society, she would not have accepted the offer. Now, this is a sort of summary statement, I think, of many theories of exploitation that are non-market. There's a whole debate about exploitation theories that I rely on but cannot fully go into here, in which market and non-market theories of exploitation are two very important competing theories of exploitation. And my view is that as soon as we move to a non-market theory of exploitation, we look at the background conditions under which exchanges or transactions in the market take place and think about whether these background conditions are just. If not, then there's pressure on one of the two parties from the other party, and you have exploitation. An elegant way, I think, of capturing this insight is by a theory from Miklos in an article from 2019, where he says, in an unjust world, there's a sort of a minimum and a maximum price, and the price falls, let's say, somewhere in between in a bargaining process. So this is P in the top hand of the scheme that you see on the slide. Compare that P, that price that is reached, to the bargaining minimum and maximum prices in under just background conditions. And if P falls outside of that range, then there is exploitation. So this is, I think, an attractive way of thinking about exploitative exchanges by looking into the background and the sort of spectrum of bargaining positions that this opens up. This is still sort of compatible with various theories of justice. So you can still, let's say, buy into Rawlsian theory of justice or capability theory of justice or basic needs view of justice or quite a number of other theories of justice to determine when exactly the background conditions are unjust. And that sort of theory of justice used to assess the background conditions you then import into your view about exploitation. Now back to Alan Thomas and property owning democracy. Is corporate exploitation structural or contingent? Would corporate exploitation be prevented by a wide dispersal of shares? Remember, this was Alan Thomas's view. He says property owning democracy is the superior alternative because a wealthy class in sort of pure capitalism, by concentrating the shares in the hands of this wealthy class, they will exploit the others. So I think he moves too quickly here. The benefits of exploitation are concentrated under the open corporation in pure capitalism, and he says it's sufficient to disperse them under property owning democracy. What this still neglects, in my view, is that the costs of exploitation, which Thomas thinks are widely dispersed amongst the population, are very often concentrated themselves as well. So you can imagine an example of an economy with 10 persons and 10 firms, right? Very simple sort of dummy example in which each firm is operated by one worker, but all of the 10 firms are owned by all 10 persons. Every person in this dummy economy has 10% of the shares. In such a situation, there's property owning democracy, so there's dispersal of the benefits of corporate activity, but there might still be concentration of the costs, the external effects that Alan Thomas has sort of recognized are important to take into account. And in every firm, 90% might still outvote 10% to have an exploitative corporate strategy for that corporation. So property owning democracy itself does not prevent exploitation on its own. A different corporate structure is needed for this, in which each corporation taken on its own is incentivized not to exploit the others. And the dispersal of the benefits of corporate activity itself doesn't guarantee this. And this is then what leads me to this alternative social ownership democracy. Social ownership democracy is made up of 3 principles, and I'll introduce them in a moment, but I'll first take one step back and then I'll get to these 3 principles. What I want to do with social ownership and democracy is to take the legal structure of the corporation seriously. The legal structure of the corporation is not just a relation between monitors and managers. The corporation is led by its management on a daily basis, but it's also a separate legal person that intermediates between all the stakeholder groups that you see grouped around the corporation on the slide. And this legal person itself, therefore, can exploit and be exploited. To make that clear, I introduced two different concepts, and you really have to sort of accept my terminology here, because each of these terms, exploitation, externalization, and extraction, are used in various ways, but I hope to sort of define these terms in a way that at least intuitively captures the many people use them. So I'm going to say that on the one hand, the corporation itself can exploit any of the stakeholding parties that it does business with. And this is what I call externalization, right? With reference to this idea of negative externalities, the term used by economists, we can say that the corporation can externalize costs towards suppliers, consumers, workers, investors, each of the stakeholding parties. So this is sort of one form of exploitation. On the other hand, the corporation itself can also be exploited, in particular by the residual claimant, so the party that wants to extract the financial benefits from corporate activity. So this is what I refer to with extraction. Both of these processes can occur in isolation. So one can happen without the other. For example, investors can extract from the corporation, even though the corporation hasn't itself externalized any costs on one of the stakeholding parties. It can have made profit by perfectly innocent forms of innovation, and then still there can be extraction. Vice versa, there can also be externalization without extraction. However, very often what we see is that costs are externalized in order then to extract them, right? So we do see very often that these processes go hand in hand. What we want to prevent is a situation in which either workers, so I take workers here as the main example, are exploited by the investors, or investors are exploited by workers. And we've seen so far, right, that both of these things are possible. Concurring with Arnold and Thomas, there's a risk in market socialism that the investors are exploited by workers. But on the other hand, contingently, as Thomas argues, or more structurally, as I argued, the workers can also be exploited by the investors, even if this is corrected through property-owning democracy. So what we are looking for is the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is a political economic system that removes the incentive to externalize by removing the possibility to extract. So think about this for a moment, right? So if externalization in the long run happens because of an interest in extraction, what we want is to remove the possibility of extraction, either by investors in the open corporation or by workers in market socialism. In other terms, we want to cancel exploitation by the investor without introducing exploitation of the investor. Can this be done? That is the million-dollar question. For a sense of drama, I take a little bit of water. Okay. Here is my hypothesis. The three principles of social ownership bring us a regime of corporate structure that minimize exploitation in the sense just defined. The first principle is what I call the primacy of purpose. So what a corporation that is minimally exploitative does, I say minimally because non-exploitative is a very strong end result, that there will always be some exploitation in any political economic system. But let's say when our goal is to minimize it, then we need corporations to specify a non-exploitative purpose. Profits are then a condition for fulfilling this purpose, which leads us to principle 2, the principle of responsible profit distribution. A corporation's policy on the distribution of profits to its shareholders or members must be responsible. not come at the long-term survival or flourishing of the corporation itself, society, and nature. And finally, we have the principle of purpose-driven control. The control rights in a corporation, so this is the ultimate decision-making rights in Arnold's theory, they must be given to a party able and willing to prioritize the company's purpose over the maximization of the value for shareholders. So these principles I take as a sort of systematization of a lot of literature on corporate purpose that has been written in corporate law, corporate governance in the last 10 years. That literature hasn't sort of reached the literature in political philosophy on property owning democracy, market socialism. And what I'm trying to do here is to, inspired by these theories of corporate purpose, think about whether you can create a regime that through corporate purpose and a profit distribution and a control right structure that is geared towards purpose minimizes exploitation in the economy. And social ownership democracy is my name for such a regime. Now, these three principles are very abstract, so we need to think about specific corporate forms in which they can be instantiated in practice. Now, the purest form to instantiate them is to have a corporation which does not have any financially motivated external investors. If you do not have external investors, then you limit exploitation structurally by design, so to speak. Now, I think there are two sort of examples of this purest form of social ownership. Cooperatives on the one hand, because they only have inside investors, members, like workers in a worker cooperative that invest in the company. Or you can also have a situation in which you do have outside investors, but they are not financially motivated. And the main example here would be foundation-owned companies. And I'll say a bit more about each of them in turn. You can also, however, have more impure forms. Impure corporate forms in which there are external investors who are partially financially interested, to the extent that this is a serious commitment on the behalf of these investors, to be only partially interested in extracting profits from the corporation. Then you have a situation in which exploitation is also limited. This remains, however, limited to the goodwill of the investor in situating themselves as partially financially interested investors. Main examples here include family firms, which, because of an interest in the long-run survival of the company, restrict themselves in extracting financially from the firm, benefit corporations, and citizen-owned funds. For the sake of time, because I'm running out of time, I will not say too much about these, but we can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. Next to pure and impure forms, we also have a distinction between pure and hybrid, if you want, which is orthogonal to this distinction between pure and impure, forms in which we reintroduce the financial investor. I'll talk about this later if there is still time. I now want to say a bit more about the two pure forms to sort of explain how the logic of social ownership democracy plays out in these contexts. The first example is cooperatives. In cooperatives, what we see is that the role of the worker is merged with the traditional roles of the investor. And so now the workers are workers. This is their functional role in the corporation, but they are also residual claimants. They are capital providers, and they are the ultimate decision makers. We get a sort of mirror image of the open corporation to the extent that all of these roles are now in the hands of workers. The only role that is split off is the manager role. So we do have this principal agent problem, but as Arnold says, this can be sort of solved. The workers, however, are now the party having the three other roles. However, that is not all. Cooperatives operate through specific rules. One of them is that the compensation that workers get is limited. Some of the profits go to individual accounts owned by the workers, but another part of the profits go to a collective account. So the corporation retains a substantial share of the profits, 45% in the case of the most famous worker cooperative, Mondragon in Spain, in their collective accounts. Another part goes to individual accounts and is only, this is something that workers only receive once they end their membership with the corporation. So they cannot claim it immediately, only a limited amount, normally 10% in the case of Mondragon, they can claim immediately as profits. So the sort of possibilities in a cooperative to extract profits are severely limited. I'm skipping the next bullet point. Want to emphasize the third bullet point here. The membership shares that workers have cannot be transferred to third parties. So there's no share market as there is for an open corporation through which workers can sell their shares. All of that limits the ability to extract. So the corporation has a sort of, if you want, a sort of commons. Some people analogize it to a commons because there is common property. This is these collective accounts that are important in the system. There might still be the possibility that the corporation, the cooperative here, exploits non-members, so the suppliers or the consumers on the slide, right? That problem still might arise. But this, I don't have a separate slide on this. We can talk about this in the Q&A, should then be prevented through giving some control rights to these other parties that are otherwise vulnerable to exploitation. So this is sort of the democracy part of the proposal of social ownership democracy. Social ownership forms part 2, the foundation-owned corporation. The foundation-owned corporation is the sort of second pure form, I think. They work differently from cooperatives. They have a foundation that acts as an investor, right? So on the previous slide, you saw that in a cooperative, there is no outside investor. Here we have an outside investor, but this is a non-profit foundation. This exemplifies the philosophy of what today also is called steward-owned ownership since 5 or 6 years or so. This is a term that has been created to capture the phenomenon that you have a firm in which the purpose is leading, and then there is a foundation, but this can also be done through other means than a foundation that anchors the purpose as what the corporation, the managers should strive to realize, and there are limited abilities to extract profits. The foundation can receive profits, and if a non-profit foundation receives profits, it can then in turn distribute them for charitable causes. But the idea of having a foundation as the ultimate decision maker, residual claimant, and capital provider is that they are only to a limited extent interested in this. After all, this is a non-profit foundation, so it doesn't try to maximize its profits. What the role of the foundation is instead is to exercise their control rights as a foundation board, as a steward for the purpose of the main company, right? So there is an alignment between the purpose of the foundation and the purpose of the company itself. This purpose is sort of a substantial activity, healing the sick, for example, for a medical company, or pharmaceutical company, and this is what the corporation should strive for and not maximize profits. Again, we could say this is the corporation as a partial form of common property, right? So the foundation either leaves most of the profits in the corporation, or when it extracts them, it can even reinvest later in the corporation or to a limited extent distribute to charitable causes. Here there might still be a residual problem of exploitative purposes, and again I would argue to the extent that a foundation or owned corporation is going to exploit suppliers, consumers, workers, other parties in the corporation, then this would be a reason to have representation of these other stakeholder groups in the stewards, so the foundation board's decision-making process. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. I'm at the end of time, so I think I'm going to skip section 5 and end it here. Katrina, would that be good for you?
Yes, but if you need some more minutes to explain the hybrid forms, that's fine.
Yeah,
good.
You want it? Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll just try
Unless
to finish
anyone
it up.
objects, I think you can.
Okay, then I'll try to finish this up in 5 minutes. So I think these two forms, foundation-owned companies and cooperatives, are really sort of useful as sort of benchmarks or sort of pure forms to think about what it would mean to have a non-exploitative company. There's one practical problem, and that is that they can't rely on outside investment, which means that they normally have to finance themselves through retained earnings, and it can take a long time if the earnings are low, and debt at banks normally, but they don't have sort of an equity investor. The foundation can normally invest a little bit, but this is often very limited. Similarly for the members, for example, the workers in a worker cooperative. So what this means is that these forms, these alternative forms of companies are sort of dependent on a model of organic growth, so growth in a market relatively slowly compared to other companies, and without outside investors who sort of inject big sums of money on a short-term basis. And that might not be enough to satisfy financing needs, especially in capital-intensive industries or in industries where your competitors can raise external forms of finance, right? So while these pure forms might be attractive from the point of view of non-exploitation, they might not survive in a competitive context. That raises the question whether we can reintroduce outside investors and still retain the social ownership character of the firm. In other words, can we have our cake and eat it too? So that would be the holy grail of social ownership democracy under non-ideal conditions of competition between these kinds of companies and standard capitalist corporations, if you want. So classical firms on the one hand and the open corporations on the other hand. Of course, as political philosophers, we can just dictate that social ownership should be mandatory and that we should forbid the open corporation as a structure. But as we all know, we live in the real world, and in the real world, these forms exist. Cooperatives and foundation-owned companies already exist, but they need to compete with regular companies, if we can call them that way. Now, both Alan Thomas and Scott Arnold, interestingly, have talked a little bit in their theories about worker cooperatives. They see that they have some potential for being non-exploitative, very interesting, but they also say these companies have a financing problem. They might not have enough money, as explained on the previous slide. I won't go into the technical details of this, but they do discuss an earlier proposal that was already written 40 years ago by Peter Jay, who argues, what if we have an economy that only exists of cooperatives? But I think you could also insert foundation-owned companies if you want, but he uses cooperatives. And you would give investors, outside investors, a role. You would ask them to invest in in cooperatives, but you would not give them voting rights. So you see this on my slide. The investors on the left-hand side do not get ultimate decision maker role. Thomas and Arnold say, well, in this situation, there would be a very serious expropriation hazard. It will be the hazard that the investors are exploited by workers because they do not have the ultimate decision-making rights, right? So you see here the return of the problem that we already saw in the context of market socialism. In that situation, the investor position was taken by the state via public banks. Here we see it is taken by private investors. In both cases, because they do not have the ultimate decision-making rights, they might be exploited by workers, argue Thomas and Arnold. There's a longer debate about this, which I have in the paper, whether this is true or not, whether this risk is real or not. We should note that we have such a system of cooperatives and also foundation-owned companies with external investors on a limited scale. So some cooperatives have some outside investors, normally only sort of a minority of investors that without voting rights are asked to invest in the company. So this is not a theoretical proposal only. It's a theoretical proposal by Peter Jay to think about this on the scale of the economy as a whole. But in practice, we already do see some cooperatives and foundation-owned companies that allow external investors. And the theoretical prediction is, well, this will then lead to the return of exploitation. My ultimate assessment in the paper of this sort of objection or problem is it's unclear. It's unclear whether workers would indeed exploit investors, perhaps. It really depends on whether they are dependent on them for raising new capital, right? So if you anticipate you need new capital from your investors, then you won't exploit them. If you don't need such new capital, then there's less of a restraint. The dependence might also be the other way around. So the investor, once reintroduced, might also try to to exploit the corporation that it is investing in, even if it does not have the ultimate decision-making rights. OpenAI, I think, is an interesting example of this, where we saw investors with a minority of control rights who are trying to exploit the corporation they invest in. Can't go into the details here. What I do conclude is that overall we probably need a reform of the financial sector here, with banks, but also with equity investors who are interested in supporting social ownership firms without exploiting them. In the case of Mondragon, the cooperative from Spain, the Basque country, I should say, because it's very closely tied to the regional identity of the Basque country. We there see a banking system which has supported Mondragon's cooperatives, and this has really been an important piece of the puzzle of adequately financing these cooperatives. Favorable tax rules are also part of the mix that would be needed, and redressing the uneven playing field between that we now have by taxing exploitative firms. So those firms that externalize costs should be penalized for doing so. I think these sort of measures are what is needed to, in the end, have these hybrid forms, but still ensure that they are non-exploitative. Now, conclusion. So what have we done? It's been a long road, I admit this, but it is important to have a sustained, deep comparative analysis of different corporate forms, to look at the classical firm, the open corporation, market socialism, the forms that I have been defending, cooperatives and foundation-owned companies in particular, as social ownership corporations, and to look at all these different forms from the point of view of exploitation. So the possibility that the different parties in and around the corporation try to exploit each other and how this can be minimized. I proposed that social ownership is a philosophy of the corporation with 3 principles that can be instantiated in different ways. So I haven't really talked about the impure forms, the family firms, citizen wealth funds, benefit corporations. But in particular, I've looked at the cooperative and the foundation-owned company, if only to briefly as sort of instantiating these 3 principles of social ownership. The core idea is that these companies can concentrate on their purpose because they are self-owned. They don't have an outside investor that is financially interested. Social ownership thereby is a new position, I think, in the debate between property-owning democracy and market socialism in particular, and state centralized forms of socialism and pure capitalism, the more extreme positions. We can also throw them into the mix as sort of the whole landscape of post-Rawlsian debate about just political economic regimes. I've also concluded that the major obstacle to its realization is the financing of social ownership corporations, especially when they need to compete with traditional companies. That's the conclusions. Thanks.
Hey, Rutger. This was incredibly rich. I have many thoughts. This was also very, I think, helpful for our project. So we now have 31 minutes to the minute for Q&A. So you can either raise your virtual hand on Teams or else write on the chat. So let's kick it off with Richard. Richard.
Hi, thank you, Rutger. This was really inspiring, absolutely fascinating stuff. I had a really good time. I'm gonna limit myself to one question, which is about your definition of exploitation.